Hello, I'm Eric Holdeman, and this is Disaster Zone, a show about emergencies and disasters that can happen anywhere and at any time. Washington State is one of the most trade-dependent states in the nation. And as a maritime state, our interests go way beyond the Puget Sound. And today we have the opportunity to be talking with Rear Admiral Keith Taylor, commander of the Coast Guard's 13th District. So welcome, Admiral Taylor, to the show, and look forward to hearing about the Coast Guard. Huge missions, not terribly, when you compare it to other military services, much smaller, but one we really depend on. So thanks for coming on the show.
Well, it's great to be here, Eric. Thank you.
All right. So you've had a distinguished career in the United States Coast Guard. You're retiring soon at 34 years of service. That would tell us a little bit about what you did over those 34 years.
Well, thanks, Eric. It's been a great joy to serve in the Coast Guard. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of wonderful things over my years. I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in 1983. I started out as a deck watch officer on a 180-foot buoy tender up on the coast of Maine, cutting my teeth, driving boats in some very dangerous shoal waters up there, serving the maritime public, making sure we got those aids on station, the right place, so that commerce could flow in and out safely and securely. I then made the decision to move on to flight training, went back to our air station on Cape Cod. I've had a chance to serve at various different air stations in various different capacities. I've got almost 5,000 hours of helicopter time, from Alaska to South Florida to the Great Lakes. It's been a wonderful experience. I've served as an aircraft maintenance officer, and I had command of our air station in Miami as my most recent operational command. Prior to going back to our headquarters, I served as the Deputy Chief of Staff when Admiral Papp, our Commandant now, was our Chief of Staff. When Admiral Allen first took over, somebody that's obviously somebody very close to disaster and resiliency and the things we're going to talk to today. Was selected as a flag officer in 2008. I took over as the Chief Financial Officer of the Coast Guard, did that for 3 years, and then had the wonderful opportunity to come out here and take command of the 13th District.
Okay. Well, that's pretty wide spectrum thing, from being a CFO, a bean counter, if you will, and then being an airplane driver from that standpoint. My wife and I, we watch Deadliest Catch, and of course the Coast Guard plays a critical role to mariners everywhere about that the rescue thing, and it's an aspect where the Coast Guard's putting their own lives, whether they're a swimmer in the water or the pilots. So thank you for that service. Any interesting story to tell about all those 5,000 hours?
I think early on in my career, I learned so much about leadership. I learned so much about risk management, and I learned so much about what it took to bring a team together and work as a group to get something done. And that's the core of what the Coast Guard does. Going a couple hundred miles offshore to George's Bank on Cape Cod as a young lieutenant on a dark night when the waves were kicking up and the wind was blowing, and really fighting to get somebody off of a fishing vessel that was in trouble. It took everything I had. I learned an incredible amount, and I've tried to carry that through. And I'll tell you what, there's nothing more rewarding, absolutely nothing that I can imagine. When you get back to the beach, you've pulled somebody out of harm's way. They hop out of the back of the aircraft and they give you a big hug. Right. Yeah. And you've saved their life, and you and your crew go in. The adrenaline that has put you on that cutting edge for 3, 4, 5 hours starts to wash away a bit, and you reflect back and go, by golly, if we hadn't done what we just did, those people wouldn't be alive today.
Yeah, very rewarding.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you command the 13th Coast Guard District. Tell us a little bit about the district itself, the size of it, the responsibilities that you have for maritime commerce and transportation in general.
Well, this is an incredibly diverse district. I have responsibilities for Coast Guard operations in 4 states, Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho. I do a lot of interface with the Canadian government because we have 125 miles of shared maritime border. We have 460,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean that we have responsibility for, 4,400 miles of coastline, another 600 miles of river system. And we have units up and down and in the lakes and doing lots of different things to make sure that we care for our primary areas. We want to make sure that things that happen on the water are done safely. We make sure that we attend to the security of our nation, and we want to do everything that we can each and every day to protect the environment.
Okay, and some people might not recognize, you'd say, okay, Coast Guard, you said Idaho and Montana. What's that role there?
Sure. We have responsibility for all navigable waters in the United States. So the Snake River, as it runs back to the Lewiston Pool, has a lot of maritime traffic. We maintain the aids to navigation. We inspect vessels that use that waterway, and we ensure its overall safety. In other parts of Idaho and Montana, we have responsibility for recreational boating safety. We work very closely with the states. We provide grant money, and our Coast Guard Auxiliary. In this district, we have about 1,500 volunteers. We pay them nothing. They give of their time, and they give of their dedication and their passion. And they provide all of the boater education classes, and they also will go down to the marinas and to the ramps and the docks, and they'll do courtesy marine exams to make sure that pleasure boaters have the right equipment aboard, they've been properly trained, so when they go out with their families, they have fun, but they do so safely.
Now, do they get reimbursed for fuel?
We do have some small reimbursement for fuel for those that operate their personal vessels as Coast Guard Auxiliary facilities, as well as we have a very small contingent, but very dedicated contingent of people in our aviation auxiliary program that get a small reimbursement for their fuel as well.
Okay, so that's the volunteer, and it's great to see that aspect, but what about the full-time Coast Guard coasties, I guess you'd call it that, and what types of equipment do you have, whether in the air or on the water?
Our Coast Guard men and women have some of the best equipment available, although in some cases it's aging. We have along the coast 47-foot motor lifeboats. They take those very small boats and they go out when the weather is the worst. 20-foot seas coming across those breaking bars, and they go across those to save lives and make sure that people get out of harm's way. We have a fleet of patrol boats, 87 feet and 110 foot out here. We have 3 air stations, North Bend, Astoria, and Port Angeles, where we have a fleet of H-65 and H-60 helicopters. We also have home ported here some of our major cutters in the Coast Guard, 2 378-foot high-endurance cutters, 3 210-foot medium-endurance cutters, and we're home for the nation's icebreaker fleet as well, with Polar Star, Polar Sea, and Healy right here in Seattle. In addition, we have 3 buoy tenders, Henry Blake in Everett, we have Fur down in Astoria, and we have one almost antique buoy tender down in Portland. The cutter there, 100-foot long, Bluebell. She was built, keel laid in 1944, commissioned in 1944. And we still have a group of Coast Guard men and women that sail her all the way up the Columbia River and the Snake River to make sure the river system, the aids to navigation on that system are ready for maritime commerce.
Is that a wooden hold?
It is not. Nope, it's a wonderful ship, but certainly technology was a lot different when she was built.
Okay.
But the crew does a great job, and if you would go aboard her today, even though she's that old, and I just had a chance to visit with that crew just a week or so ago and had breakfast, she looks great because our crews take wonderful care of the equipment we give them, even though sometimes we can't replace it quick enough for the needs of the service.
You depend on it.
We
right?
do.
Yes, right. Well, the first time I met you, I think I was at a conference, and I heard you talk about disaster resiliency. And I was going to ask you to talk about how you articulate it, but I would first say you were very articulate at talking about resiliency. And how do you communicate that to people within the command and also to the private sector that you deal with?
I think that's a great question. It's a challenge sometimes. I think internal to the Coast Guard, we spend a lot of time now talking about personal resiliency for all of our own folks. That really gets to their proficiency and their ability to do their jobs. How well trained are they? How active have they been out in the environment at which they're going to have to serve when things are the toughest? How well is their family doing? Financially, all the different things that allows them hopefully to show up at their unit and do whatever they do for the Coast Guard without having to worry about things. So there's a personal resiliency piece of this. Then we transform that into each of our units needs to be resilient. We have small units all the way along the coast here in the Pacific Northwest. Obviously, here in Seattle, we have a lot of Coast Guard men and women that serve, but we're in a large metropolitan area.
And what would a small unit be? How many people?
Be one of our motor lifeboat stations on the coast. If you go out to La Push, our station called Quillia River, we have 35 people assigned there. On one of our small patrol boats, there are 11 people assigned to that unit. They need to be able to be resilient to recover, regenerate, and go out and begin to operate their unit again as quickly as possible. Then you look across the whole organization. I have to be able to assess how people are doing, what the status is of all of our facilities, all of our equipment, and redirect it as necessary to make sure we buy down risk wherever it may be happening and in whatever form it may take. Then you have to take that model external. A lot of the work we've done recently with industry is really working a lot on risk and how do you manage risk and what types of risk you face and how can you invest to buy down risk in some areas. I'll tell you one thing I've learned as I've been out here. You mentioned it early on, Eric. One is the importance of maritime out here and really, truly how little people know about the maritime when you get away from the waterfront.
Wow. Yep.
The other part is, having served in South Florida for 5 years, everybody down there is aware of the hurricane risk. Every year people get ready for it. Everybody broadcasts.
1 June.
Everybody broadcasts public service announcements related to that risk.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that goes on to ready everybody psychologically for it. Out here we face a big risk with an earthquake and the resulting tsunami. But it hasn't happened in a long time, and nobody can tell me exactly when it's going to happen again, even though we know it will. So how do we get everybody ready for that unknown that will happen at some unknown point in the future? And that's what we need to be about.
Okay. And anything you've found that's successful in trying to do that? I used to try and use disasters when they were in the news, whether it's Hurricane Sandy or earthquake that happened in Japan, when people are paying attention to try and, okay, let's pay attention here because they're listening. Anything you've done in the past to try and get that message out when people are actually listening?
I think you mentioned one of them. And you hate to say that you take the opportunity when there's a disaster somewhere else, but the reality is that does offer the opportunity to talk about, educate, inform people about how that could happen to us and what we should be doing in preparation for that. So I think that's an important one. I share my experiences in South Florida. The things that we did there to ready our units, to ready our families, to ready communities to deal with what was going to be potentially a horrific disaster. And I think both of those combined together incredibly important. The third element I would say is we need thought leaders to grab the idea and talk about it regularly and in a consistent way. And I think that's one of the things we continue to work on out here.
Okay. Hopefully this show today will help advance that with you as a thought leader.
Great.
And strange but true, we're already halfway through our program. And so for you folks at home, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking to Admiral Taylor about the international aspect of the 13th Coast Guard and our Canadian neighbors. So don't go away, and we'll be right back.
In the event of a catastrophe, you need to know what to do to make it through. By preparing now, you and your family will have a better chance of surviving when a catastrophe happens. Here are 3 tips to get you started. Have an emergency plan with meeting places and an out-of-area contact. Prepare a supply kit for your family and pets that includes what you need to survive for 7 to 10 days. And be prepared to help each other. Start now and take the first step to protect the ones you love. For more information, visit makeitthrough.org or find us on Facebook.
Hello, I'm Eric Holdeman. If you're just joining us today after our break, we're talking with Rear Admiral Keith Taylor, commander of the 13th Coast Guard District. And why don't we pick up, Admiral Taylor, where we left off. But let's talk about that international connection and the cross-border planning and resiliency work that's been done here in the Northwest between Canada and the United States.
Would love to. About 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago now, under the Beyond the Border plan that the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States signed, we had an element of that. There were several elements that involved the Coast Guard, but one particularly was to do a prototype for maritime resiliency. And we partnered with Transport Canada and Penwar to bring together a team that would involve industry. It would involve state and local stakeholders and federal enterprise to look at, if we have disruption to maritime infrastructure, what we would do to regenerate the ability to move commerce in this region quickly and efficiently, to not only deal with the effects of whatever the disruption might have been, but also to allow the recovery to happen that much quicker.
Okay, and you mentioned Penwar, something I didn't brief you on. We are an acronym-free show. So
I'm sorry, I violated that standing order.
I didn't tell you, but so the Penwar is the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, and it's the organization I work with there. But what's unique about Penwar that helps, in the partnering, helping do this public, private, and binational aspect?
Well, I think the Pacific Northwest Economic Region,
that's right.
Penwar, a very important partner here. The thing Penwar brought to this was expertise in this area. The relationship with the states, the provincial governments, and then bringing segments of industry together, transportation, energy, agriculture, tourism, all of those things, and a consistent level of work on resiliency and how you recover from outages, disasters, consequence management was exactly the thing we were looking to work on. So Penwar, in concert with our partners in Canada and Transport Canada and the U.S. Coast Guard, we were able to bring all of our stakeholders together, and that provided an invaluable forum to really move ahead and develop a protocol for how we would handle one of these major emergencies that would be sure to affect both the United States and Canada here in the boundary area that we both live in.
Okay. And, it's not just government. I mean, certainly it seems that government is very involved at the times of disasters, and it seems like it's all about government. But what about the private sector and that role, whether in this planning or just in general? What is your message you want to leave about the private sector's role in all this?
Private sector critically important here for any type of response and recovery. We need to lay out a plan. We need to have the way to communicate. We need to have the ability to direct things to happen in a certain sequence. But industry is exceptionally good at understanding risk in many areas, having great information about the current status of their facilities, their vessels at sea, all of those things. The solution will not be a government-only solution. It's a binational solution, and that's why industry and the private sector is so important here.
Okay. And we talked a little bit earlier about trying to motivate people and individuals to see the importance of resiliency. So the initial body of work has been done. What do you think is the challenge and the opportunity to keep that work going here in the region now that the grant funding is over and we aren't having the sessions we had previously?
Well, Eric, I mentioned earlier thought leaders. So we need a group of thought leaders to understand the importance of this body of work and move it to the next level. This was always designed to be a starting point. And right now we're working very closely with the states and the provincial governments through Penwar to memorialize the work that was done. The report has been completed, but really building this into an emergency management framework is the next step out here. This should also move east, the Great Lakes region onto the eastern seaboard and the Maritimes, because this is what needs to be done across this very interesting, very complex maritime border we have with Canada.
And the maritime commerce, having worked at a port, it's easily the most interdependent industry I can think of. And I read this quote recently from someone involved in that planning you were talking about. Maritime commerce has more moving parts than an expensive watch. So what makes this so complicated? Doesn't it just happen?
It absolutely does not just happen. The maritime is exceptionally complex. First, you have an uncertain weather, challenging conditions, you have flows of water, you have tides, you have current. Anytime you're operating on the water, it's vastly different than being on land. So you have that first complexity. Then you have an unbelievable diversity of people that use the water for very different things. from fishing commercially or recreationally to moving a 1,000-foot container ship in and out of one of our deep water ports. Just look at the waterfront here in Seattle. To the north, Elliott Bay Marina, recreational boats. There's over 400,000 rec boats in Oregon and Washington alone.
Really?
We have an active grain terminal where 400,000 recreational boats.
All right.
Lots of people to go out and have fun on boats. But they need to do it smartly. They need to wear their life jackets so they don't get in trouble. We have cruise ship terminal, commercial fishing, high-speed ferries, the largest ferry system in the United States with the Washington State Ferry. We've got a large container port. We have our facility down at Pier 36 where we have the nation's only icebreaker fleet. We're building ships at Vigor Shipyard in Seattle, and we have an oil terminal right here. That's just outside of our window here in Seattle. Expand that across Puget Sound, through the Columbia River Basin. All of those people are moving in different directions, in different ways, with different operators, with different desired outcomes. It's complex, and it makes what little hair I have hurt.
I empathize with your issue on the hair part anyway. So, we've been talking about resiliency. It's kind of a amorphous blob out there. It's kind of a buzzword today versus disaster preparedness has been used in the past and that. But how would you define success for maritime resiliency? And when will this work be done?
Okay, it'll never be done.
Yeah.
Because there's always more to do. Right now, we're working on laying down the framework for plans, because you have to start somewhere. And in my mind, one of the baseline pieces of plans is communications. How do you get good information? What's really going on? How do you communicate real time with stakeholders, with the public? How do you work across industry? How do you work across the federal, state, and local enterprise? How do you interact in all of those different areas to come to a common outcome when there may be limited resources for response, and ultimately somebody has to make a decision about where the next thing goes when you're dealing with disaster? That's what we're working on now. There's been a ton of great work done. The plans are laid in place. We continue to exercise those plans, mature those plans. But I've been around the Coast Guard business for a long time. When something bad happens, the plan is your starting point, because it will be unique, and it will require creative solutions, and people will have to move outside the boundary of that plan to really truly be successful in leading our response to a major catastrophic event.
Okay. So what do you think's been the most successful part to date? And what do you think is the body of work that really remains to be done? I mean, what do you feel good about, and what do you say, well, shoot, we didn't get this done, we need to do more of this, besides just continuing the effort? Anything in particular?
Well, the thing I'm most proud of, and it's just the reinforcement of what already existed. We have tremendous relationships with all the different elements within the Canadian government that we work so closely with. Transport Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the military within Canada as well. So it reestablished, reinforced that. We have great relationships, which we've always had, with industry. The maritime industry, we absolutely have to work very closely with them. While we regulate the maritime industry in the United States, we also have to work with them to make sure we come to shared outcomes. We understand the dynamics of things that are going on. This work that we've done over the last year has reinforced all of that, and it's laid the framework down. Now we need to get it built into an emergency management agreement, and that's the next step.
Okay. And to do that, it's more meetings and exchanging wording for that plan, or?
I think the next step, and those discussions are ongoing right now with the states, with the provincial governments, within the federal sector, between Ottawa and Washington, D.C., to define how we want to take this prototype, this starting point, and really lay it down as a framework that we want to build upon. More work to be done.
Okay. And this was I don't know whether you called it the pilot, but the initial piece out here in the Northwest. And then there's some plan to do the Great Lakes and the East Coast. Do you have any information on that?
Certainly the plan has always been for this to move east, Great Lakes, and then on to the eastern seaboard. Certainly at this time, there's constraints across the board on funding. Yep. So it's an uncertain next step right now. related to funding as to what the next step will be. We should not get discouraged by that. This is the right thing to do. We should continue to press on.
Okay. So I'm going to insert a quick question in here that you didn't have, but you can answer it, I promise you. Is, what's the difference between the Navy? We have a heavy Navy presence here, and then we have the Coast Guard. How would you divide that up? I mean, for people who don't know anything about the maritime thing, sector.
Well, we work very closely with the Navy here, and some of my closest partners, Admiral Mark Rich, who's the commander of the Navy Region Northwest, he owns all the installations out here in the Pacific Northwest. Admiral Dietrich Kuhlman, who is commander of Subgroup 9 over in Bangor, he has responsibility for all the submarines out in this area. So we work very closely with them. They're here getting the fleet ready to put to sea, to ensure that the national interest of the United States is projected around the globe. We're here each and every day managing commerce, making sure that the waterways are in good shape, managing traffic in and out, inspecting on an annual basis thousands of foreign vessels that call on our ports here to make sure that they meet the requisite international and U.S. standards for safety, security, and environmental protection. We are a regulatory agency as well. We regulate the maritime industry. The U.S. Navy does not do that. We work together. We are strong partners in concert with the Marine Corps, the Merchant Marine, the Sea Service are so important to our country because we are a maritime nation.
Each play a critical role. So we're about 2 minutes out from being done, and I wanted to just have you mention very briefly about the challenges of the Arctic kind of opening up. So we do only have a couple minutes.
Sure. Arctic is fascinating. I work very closely with my peer up in Alaska, our 17th District Commander, Tom Ostavo. Obviously, he has direct operational responsibility for the Arctic Reach. Down here, we look to the future, and I see a future that involves more ships getting ready to go to the Arctic here. We're going to need to be able to inspect them, make sure that they're ready in every way, shape, or form. We're going to need to then make sure that as it relates to the Arctic, because the Arctic is going to have activity. I can't tell you when, I can't tell you how much, but everything says there's going to be more, whether it's drilling, whether it's commerce, whether it's economic tourism. And we as a Coast Guard have a responsibility to ensure that those things happen the same in the Arctic as they do here in Puget Sound. And we need to be ready for that. As a nation, we have an incredible interest there, and we need to continue to build out the capabilities we need as a nation to ensure that our interests are protected in that very important region.
All right. Well, listen, we're just about out of time at this point, and I just want to thank you for coming on the show, talking about the Coast Guard very passionately. I would say people, I'm sure, will appreciate your passion for the Coast Guard, and just want to thank you for your service and whatever they say in the Coast Guard, smooth sailing, fair winds. I don't know what's the...
Well, our motto is Semper Paratus, and I can tell you all the young women who serve tonight, tomorrow, and the next day here, they're always ready to serve.
Okay, and I took Latin, but Semper Paratus is always?
Always ready.
Always ready. There you go. Oh, well, thank you for being always ready for your 34 years.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Right. And this brings us to the end of our show for today. Thanks for tuning in and learning more about what you and others can do to become better prepared for disasters. And as we talked about today, resiliency starts with you. So if you're going to get prepared, today is a good day to start. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.